Who would be the monarch of the UK today if the Jacobite succession had been followed? In today's video, we will look at the alternative Jacobite succession. If it had been followed, the marriages that would later occur may never have happened. And for that reason, we will follow the Jacobite succession as it was and is currently. In 1603, Elizabeth I of England died without any children. Her cousin, James VI of Scotland, became the king. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. For the first time, the English and Scottish thrones were ruled by the same monarch. James took the regnal name of James I of England, so he was both James VI and first. He ruled until 1625. He had 7 children with his wife, including Elizabeth, Queen of Bohemia, and Charles I. It is through Elizabeth and Charles that the 2 lines of succession were formed. Charles I became king in 1625. He married Henrietta Maria of France, and they had 9 children together. In 1649, he lost his head after the Civil War, and for 11 years, Scotland and England had no monarch. In 1660, the English Parliament offered back the throne to Charles' eldest surviving son, Charles, and he accepted becoming Charles II. He was married to Catherine of Braganza, but unfortunately they had no living children. Charles died in 1685, and his Catholic brother James became James II and 7th. James had 2 living daughters from his first marriage to Anne Hyde. Their names were Mary and Anne, and both were Protestant. James married again to Mary of Modena, who was Catholic. This troubled the English Parliament. Since Elizabeth I, every monarch had been Protestant. However, because James's heir was his daughter Mary, who was Protestant, Parliament weren't too worried. This would change in 1688 when James's wife Mary gave birth to a son, also named James. At the time, male preference primogeniture was in use. This meant that the eldest surviving son took precedence over his elder sisters. As James's son was baptized Catholic, this greatly concerned Parliament, as it was likely that the next monarch would be Catholic, and every monarch after would also be Catholic too. In what would become known as the Glorious Revolution in 1688, Mary, James's daughter, and her husband William arrived in England with an army. James fled to France, and Mary and William became co-monarchs of England and Scotland as Mary II and William III. James attempted to gain back his throne, but was unsuccessful. His followers became known as Jacobites, as Jacob is the alternative version of James. According to the Jacobites, James was considered to be king until his death in 1701. William and Mary never had any children, so upon their deaths, Mary's younger sister Anne became queen in 1702. She united England and Scotland as Britain in 1707 under the Acts of Union. Her half-brother was considered to be king by the Jacobites and would have been known as James III and VIII. He would have ruled for 65 years from 1701 to 1766. When Anne died, there were no close relatives aside from James, her half-brother. Britain wanted a Protestant monarch, and James would not convert to Protestantism. So Parliament had to look way down the line of succession to find the next Protestant relative. If we look back at the family tree, Charles I had a sister named Elizabeth, who married Frederick, Elector Palatine. They had a daughter named Sophia, who married Ernest Augustus, Elector of Brunswick-Luneburg. Sophia was named Anne's heir, but she died shortly before Anne did, so her eldest son George became the heir. In 1714, Anne died, and George succeeded as George I of Great Britain and Ireland. He was also the King of Hanover. This heir renewed the efforts of the Jacobites, who claimed that as a foreign-born prince, he shouldn't be king, and they used this as an excuse to put James III on the throne. There were a number of attempts in 1715 and 1719, but they both failed. James III had a son called Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was known as the Young Pretender, and his father was known as the Old Pretender. Charles led a revolt in 1745 known as the Battle of Culloden. This was the last serious attempt to restore the Stuart dynasty, and it failed. Charles would have been Charles III. Charles had no legitimate children, and when he died in 1788, his younger brother Henry would have been Henry IX. However, by that point, there were no serious attempts made to restore the Stuarts to the throne. Henry was a cardinal and had no children. As such, the line of succession would have moved on to the children of Princess Henrietta, the sister of James II. Henrietta had a stronger claim to the throne than Sophia, but Henrietta had died by this point. Henrietta married Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, and they had a daughter named Anne-Marie of Orleans. She married King Victor Amadeus II of Sardinia, and they had a child named Charles Emmanuel III of Sardinia, who had a son named Victor Amadeus III of Sardinia. At the time of Henry's death in 1807, Charles Emmanuel IV of Sardinia would have been the next monarch. He would have gone by the name of Charles IV and ruled until his death in 1819. He did not have any legitimate children at the time of his death, so the next monarch would have been his younger brother, Victor Emmanuel I of Sardinia, who according to the Jacobite succession would have been King Victor. His eldest surviving child was his daughter Mary, who would have been Mary III. She married Francis IV, Duke of Modena, and their eldest son was Francis V, Duke of Modena. In this line of succession, he probably would have taken the regnal name of Francis, and so would have been Francis I. He had no surviving children, and his younger brother Ferdinand died before him. Ferdinand had a daughter named Mary, who would be the next monarch. Mary probably would have taken the name Mary IV, and she married King Ludwig III of Bavaria. They had a son named Robert. Upon her death in 1919, Robert would have succeeded as both Robert I and IV of the United Kingdom. Robert's eldest son was Albert, who would have been king in 1955 and ruled until 1996. His eldest son, Francis, would be Francis II and would be the current monarch of the United Kingdom. Francis II has no children, so his younger brother, Max, would be the next king, followed by Max's daughter, Sophie. Sophie is the hereditary princess of Liechtenstein, and her eldest son is Joseph Wenzel, who would be third in line to the throne. So one day, Joseph will be the reigning prince of Liechtenstein and the Jacobite heir.